If you watch any of my Edelbrock tuning videos, you know these aren't complicated or difficult to tune, but they can be a little different at times. And today I'm going to show you 6 little quirky things about this carburetor and what the solutions are to them. So let's get started. So one funny question that I get asked occasionally is, why does my carburetor making a ticking sound at idle? And that is usually caused by the step-up spring not being strong enough and holding the piston down into the bore. It's fairly common. Most folks don't think about anything other than setting idle mixture screws when they talk about tuning a carburetor. Hopefully you all have watched enough of my videos now to know that there's a lot more to this and a lot more you can get out of these carburetors. But the step-up springs is one that typically gets neglected. For whatever reason, most car guys or girls don't start with the basics. You know, what is your engine idle vacuum on the manifold side where you're getting full vacuum? Knowing that, that will help you set that spring to get it to the right size. Now, when you're setting the springs, we talked about this in a previous video, and I'm going to go back and forth and reference some videos that I've already done so you can go back and watch those. But as a base, that step-up spring rating is half of what your engine vacuum is. So you can go back and watch that video and see it, but what it is happening is that little piston is hitting the bottom of the cover. Again, it's kind of annoying, but if you get it set right, you're going to be running a lot better anyway on the tuning side. On the electric choke, it seems to be a little confusing with some folks on how to hook these up, but one question that I do get asked, other than where do you get the power wire from, again, you can check out the video I did on that, but do you need to run a fuse between the power line or the power feed going into it and the electric choke? And the answer to that is no, you do not need to run a fuse. If you really think you need one, the amp draw is so low on there, it's 0.5 of an amp, half an amp. If you feel like you need one, you can run a 10 amp fuse in that wire, but it's not necessary. I've never ever seen anyone run a fuse and have it blow, and even if it did, that electric choke is pretty robust. It's not like it's got a lot of electronics in there. So do you run a fuse with your choke wire? The answer to that's no. One comment is that the engine stalls when it comes to an abrupt stop or a really sharp turn. How to fix this? There's a couple of things. One, we just talked about it with the step-up springs. It's understanding the vacuum of the engine and where to set the idle mixture screws. That's the first thing to check. The second one is we've also talked extensively about setting up a fuel system, and shame on me for not having the diagram to throw in front of you like I've done 100 times, but getting the fuel system set up right. 6 pounds of pressure is the maximum you want to give these Edelbrock carburetors. So make sure that your pressure regulator is set between 4.5 to 6 pounds of pressure. Anything more than that, too much pressure to the carburetor could cause it to stall because now you are dumping fuel into the engine. It is too much, doesn't need it. It will choke and kill the engine out. The other one is making sure that you have your float set properly. So make sure you use a 7/16 or the 1/2 inch drill bit. And how to adjust that, we talked about that in another video also, but make sure your floats are set properly. It's typically one of those 3 things that is causing that condition. So get those 3 set right, and you'll stop stalling when you come to a stop. Another question is they have a carburetor that whistles, and I always find that one kind of funny because I usually make an off-color comment like, well, what tune is it whistling at you? But it's usually not that funny. There's 2 things you can check immediately, and that's gaskets. We've talked about how the importance of the air cleaner gasket. For whatever reason, I've seen it thousands of times, it seems like, where somebody will put an air cleaner directly on top of the carburetor. There's a reason why that gasket is provided. You need that. It will seal the air cleaner to the air horn assembly of the carburetor. You've got to have that. Don't discount that. Always use an air cleaner gasket. So make sure it's not ripped or torn or something that would cause it not to work right. Very, very important, very, very overlooked. Second is the base plate gasket. Now, this one's typically a little easier because it's going to cause typically a big vacuum leak if you got a really bad tear in there, if you got a chunk missing out of there. But there are times where it's maybe just a little bit of a tear and just enough air is getting underneath there that it won't cause a rough idle or a stumble across or a poor condition of driving. So that's another common one. I've seen that a few times anyway. Those two things are usually the ones that cause it. And a little bit of carburetor cleaner, something carefully sprayed around there when the engine's idling, can help you find any of those vacuum leaks that the carburetor's having. But almost 9 times out of 10, it's the air cleaner gasket that's causing that issue. Here's one that's kind of annoying, but it's certainly a very common problem here. We've talked quite a bit about fuel system stuff, and every time we talk about tuning, we always talk about fuel system. But another common question is you get fuel leaking out of the carburetor. It's leaking out of the boosters. You can see it at idle. It's coming out of the throttle shafts. I've seen a number of different things. It's filling up in the little reservoir on the AVS or the Performer Series carburetor where the weighted air valve is at. Lots of different things in there. Typically, there's some really common things here, and almost all of them go back to our fuel system setup. First thing you need to do is ensure that your pressure regulator is set correctly. Again, we've talked about that 100 times. Give yourself another adjustment point within the system. Get a pressure regulator in there. 4.5 to 6 psi. I make mention of that quite often, but you'd be very, very surprised how many people don't run a regulator or send me a message looking for some help with their carburetor. I ask what it's set to, and they go, it's a stock pump. It doesn't need one. Absolutely, it needs one. Fuel pressure is the number one reason why these carburetors will leak on you. Almost 100% of the time, that's the first thing you look at. Second would be to take the top air horn assembly off the carburetor and look at all of the pieces and parts within there. Make sure there's no debris or garbage in the needle and seat. Make sure that the needle and seat's in good shape. It hasn't been damaged, or the little nipple end of it is seating correctly in there. If the needle is not seating correctly, it doesn't shut the fuel off. It will add more fuel to the carburetor, and it will cause that leaking condition. Typically it doesn't push out the throttle shafts, but it will push down and certainly give you a very, very rich foul condition at idle, and a lot of black smoke and garbage typically as you're trying to cruise down the road. So check the needle and seat. While you're there, checking the floats is another really good idea. Make sure that they're in good shape. Take the float off and shake it. Make sure that there's no fuel that's gotten in there. It means there's a little pinhole, or typically around the seam. When they get older, they will deteriorate and allow fuel in there. If that's the case, the float will always be sunk. It'll always be pushing fuel to raise it. It won't be able to do so. Adds more fuel. You get into an issue there. So just check the floats and make sure they're in good shape. As long as they are in good shape going back together, make sure you set the floats to the correct level. Again, the 7/16 drill bit method works really, really well. If you're in a little bit hotter climate, hotter weather, the 1/2-inch drill bit's typically my favorite because it lowers the fuel level down just a little bit. The last one is typically a summertime one, and we've talked about this quite a number of times with heat soak on these carburetors. If you got an aluminum or an iron intake manifold, doesn't really matter what type of material, that heat transfers through there and into aluminum very, very easily. So make sure you take care of the heat soak. The video I did on that is very, very good because it shows you all the details on how to help get rid of it. A phenolic spacer or a wood laminate spacer between the carburetor and the intake manifold is good. Don't run an aluminum spacer between the manifold and the carburetor. It will just transfer the heat even better. So you need to have something that blocks the heat through there. Heat soak is a very, very common one. So those 4 or 5 little tips there will help you control the leaking fuel. It all really just depends on where it's all coming from, what part of the carburetor, but one of those will typically solve you. Start with the pressure. It's almost always it. And the last little weird complaint that I get is there's a strong smell of fuel when you change the oil. We're going to go right back to a lot of the same things we've already talked about. Make sure that the pressure is set correctly, 4.5 to 6 pounds. Make sure the floats are set properly. If they are set too high, you're going to cause a rich condition. Idle mixture screws certainly are part of it. Go through the tuning process. Make sure you're tuning the carburetor. The power mode and the cruise mode on the tuning chart. Again, another great video to help you read that chart and help you figure out how to go through that tuning process. Big important things there. Needle and seats, make sure again on those floats, make sure they're in good shape. A lot of the same reasons, just means you've got a very rich condition that you haven't addressed that you need to take care of. Again, on that one, it's almost, most of the time anyway, it is just an improperly tuned carburetor and pressure that's too high. So get all those things dialed in. It'll help correct that issue as well. You certainly don't want a lot of fuel in the oil. What that does is it deteriorates the additive package that's in there with the zinc. If you're running a high zinc oil, huge problem to deteriorate that. The detergent package deteriorates very quickly. Fuel is horrible at ruining all those things. So you don't get a long service life out of your oil when it's got fuel in it. It's one of the big reasons why racers change oil so frequently, because there's usually terrible blow-by on those engines. A lot of fuel gets in the oil, need to get rid of it. So it's a bad situation all around. That one you just need to be careful of when you're doing your oil change. Make sure there's not a strong smell of it. If there is, then start doing some investigating. Check the spark plugs, make sure they're not black and fouled, and then start going through the tuning process and see how things are running. Check the tailpipe, make sure it doesn't have a lot of soot and nastiness in there. So that's the sixth one. How do you get rid of the fuel smell in the oil? Well, most of the time, it's being introduced in somewhere. You just got to chase it down and see where it's at. So I hope something in that list helped you out. Again, those are very weird and not very common questions that I get asked, but they're certainly common enough that I felt it was a good idea to put them all in one video, talk about little tuning issues. And again, really it boils down to the basics. Once you get the foundation set properly, and ignition timing and fuel system are the two most neglected things when it comes to carburetor tuning. They go hand in hand. Timing and tuning go hand in hand. You can't tune a carburetor without adjusting the ignition. You can't do either one of those until you have a really good foundation in the fuel system. So give yourself every advantage. Get a good pressure regulator and get the setup right. Get the right number of filters in there and make sure you're getting all of that garbage out of there. And then start going through the tuning process and start, adjusting that carburetor out to where it performs well and it's not too rich of a condition. A lot of things will help you out there if you just follow the basics and again, follow some of the tips that I've given you in some of those past videos. So if you have any questions on this one today, please don't hesitate to leave them down below. If you've got another funny little quirky little thing that your Edelbrock carburetor is doing that you don't quite understand, leave them in the comments down below. Maybe I'll do another video with these and add 5 or 6 more little oddball little things that these do, and we'll talk about it. If it helps somebody out, even better. So don't hesitate. Please leave me those comments. I love reading them. I love answering them, and hopefully those that you that have left comments before know how enthusiastic I am to help you get the thing solved. And at the end of the day, I just want you to have a good running, driving, fun, hot rod. And if I can help make that happen with you, we did it together, and even better. So anyway, that's it for today. We will catch you guys on the next one. We'll see you.